missing from the bio that I gave Ted was the fact that I used to work for GVSHP as well, way back when. So I know the crowd. So I tend to be a roamer at the podium. So if I roam too far, I know someone will give me a signal that I need to roam back. But I want to thank Ted and GVSHP for inviting me back, especially after the last topic, which was rather depressing and cataloged a number of deaths. And it was just overall, hopefully, a fun night, but rather depressing. So it'll be a little bit more uplifting this evening, hopefully, we'll see. But as GVSHP, they asked me to kind of think about doing a talk about a founding family or an early family in Greenwich Village. And I started looking at my village books and looking at the lore and looking at the stories. And Penelope Barrow suggested that I take another look at the Brevoorts. And I'm very glad that she did, because when I kind of refreshed my memory, suddenly there were all these stories of stubborn Dutchmen, bears, deer, balls, stopping streets, and all this fabulous, crazy mythology. And that's really something I enjoy in history. A kind of history becomes very complex, and this mythology starts to form in an effort to simplify the story. And although perhaps in the case this evening, you'll see the mythology actually complicates it a little bit more. But regardless, for me, it's an interesting way to kind of step into history, to look at that mythology and see if I can figure out what is true and false. And I will be, honest about it. I'm a bit of a skeptic, so I approach things assuming they will be false. But there are a plethora of stories about the Brevoorts, and this is kind of a generic, kind of the general mythology that is out there. Can everybody see all right? Oh, great. The lights are dimming a little bit. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. So this is from the early 20th century, and it tells kind of the basic tale. Often it's Henry or Hendrik Brevoort, and is kind of credited with, I guess, early preservation in a way in the village, refusing to have his farm destroyed for the sake of progress. And this would be a farm roughly from Bowery to Fifth Avenue, from 9th Street to about 11th Street. So tonight we're kind of just outside of those boundaries, but right adjacent to it. Further stories talk about the house itself that Henry was trying to save. Sometimes it's wood, sometimes it's brick, including bricks brought over from Holland. Skeptic about that one. And also about his farm, that it was full of birds and deer and, interestingly, evidently a bear that, depending on the version, was either just peacefully in the garden or was ferociously guarding the melon patch. Again, a little skeptical about that one. These stories also have two elements for the most part, and they're really about this Henry or Hendrik stopping progress. And there are two stories. There's the story of the Broadway Bend at 10th Street, for which he is credited, as well as the blocking of 11th Street. And in some stories, he is standing in his, of course, Dutch door farmhouse with his blunderbuss or gun and refusing to let the city come through and demolish his farmhouse. There are actually two wonderful odes to Henry that were written in the late 18th and early 19th century that really document these two stories. The first is the Broadway Bend, and this is the Dutchman's quirk, which I will not read in the entirety for you, but it's rather fabulous. Old Hendrik Brevoort in What Matters the Date. Obviously, I object to that. It does matter the date. But I love the description. This one really focuses on the fact that he loved his tulip tree. And because he loved his tulip tree, a tulip tree mighty of burgeon and girth, so stately and proud, wide-branching, great-bowed, he refused to let Broadway cut through his orchard. And so the mayor and the council had sanctioned a plan to straighten the roadways that rambled or ran, cross-hatching our aisle in a wonderful style. And it talks about him being successful in stopping Broadway, and thus that theoretically explains why Broadway takes a little bend at 10th Street. It's all for the sake of a tulip tree. These are tales. The second story is the story of 11th Street, also documented in poetry, the old Brevoort farm. And this one, it's very interesting. You'll notice they kind of go between Henry and Hendrik. This one claims the ancestor's name is Rip. So it's really trying to get very Knickerbockian and ye olde Dutch about it. And again, it's about objecting to change and talking about the commissioners coming to him and saying, the red lines in blue, they duly explained, the land this one owned, the bounds that one claimed, an assessment put here and there an award, to run curb and gutter through garden and sward. He listened in patience as long as he could, and then he remarked he'd be blanked if they should. So again, it talks about his firm stance and objecting to the path of progress. So you'll notice the confusion between the various Henrys, and thence somewhat the name of this talk. I had to come up with a description quite a while ago, and I was in the midst of trying to figure out who in the world all of these people were. And I'm going to skip, for the most part, what I kind of refer to as the begatting. So-and-so begat so-and-so, and that really heavy genealogy, but I think it is important that we have a little bit of a timeline so we can figure out which Henrys we're actually talking about. So we start with the first Brevoort, who arrives from the Netherlands, and not to Greenwich Village, sorry. He arrives to Long Island. He then moves, but not to Greenwich Village, sorry, to Harlem, in about the 1670s, and it would be his son, Johannes or John or Jan, known by many names, who ultimately purchases land in Greenwich Village. This is about 1700, 1701. The sources all kind of conflict about this, but that's roughly the time period. And then it is his family that kind of establishes this farm and stays in the village. So then you have Hendrik number 3. And then I'm really sorry, we're gonna cut off a little bit on the screen here. I tend to have heavy visuals, but I was clicking and you would be able to see Hendrik the 4th. So we've got a few Hendriks, but no Henrys yet. It's really with Hendrik the 4th that kind of our modern story starts. When he dies, about 1771, it takes some time, but by 1784, his descendants finally survey and divide his property, and we end up with a list of his surviving children, and it is, if you can see at the very bottom, Henry emerges. And I'd like to you to think of this as our Henry for the evening, one of two Henrys we'll really be focusing on, known as Henry Sr. So he, at about that time, about 1784, inherits really roughly 40 acres of farmland. And this includes the family farmhouse, which, if you can see, we'll have another close-up version later. But it's right here at the edge. So it's right at Bowery, so at the very eastern edge of the property, and the boundaries kind of go all the way to 5th. This is roughly 11th, and then down to 9th Street. So that's about 40 acres. And he is kind of the progenitor of all of the crazy lore that I discussed earlier. So what did this farmhouse look like outside of these myths, which emerge in the late 19th and early 20th century, and which again, I kind of take with a grain of salt. So here we have a little bit of a close-up with the great Randall map. So about 1819, again, here's a boundary, and this is the farmhouse right here. And it is very roughly where 11th Street meets 4th Avenue today, where you have roughly 94 to 98 4th Avenue, would it be, what is now Grace Church School. So that's where the farmhouse stood. And you can see that it certainly wasn't alone. There were other houses, other buildings on Henry's property, and he had neighbors such as Sailor Snug Harbor to his south and other neighbors and houses. And in the kind of late 18th to early 19th century, there are 4 to 6 people living in the house, in the farmhouse, including family members, and in 1790, still 1 slave within the household. What did that farm, outside of this fabulous map, what did that farm actually look like? Which is difficult to tell. But this is a fabulous, I'm hoping you can see it, it's a wonderful view from what is now Union Square South, depicting about the 1820s. And I have a little zoom up there. And where the circle is, if you can see this kind of, I knew I would do that. You can see this heavily wooded area. That is what I believe is Henry Brevoort's property. So this little house is probably not his, tantalizing as it is. I was really hopeful. But I think that his would be tucked away in this property. So again, we're roughly 14th Street looking south, and that would be kind of roughly where 11th Street kind of goes through here and to the end of the property. Now, surprisingly, for a farmhouse that stood from the 18th century to about the 1840s, I've been able to find very few sketches, depictions of the house. This is one from the 1850s, from the New York Historical Society. This gentleman did this fabulous little sketchbook, his memories of houses when he grew up, and he labeled this the Brevoorts at Bowery and Broadway, and mentions going there to buy market vegetables. Whether this is a truthful depiction or not, I don't know, but it's one of the few that I've been able to find. There are plenty from the 20th century. This is a rather romantic view of the farmhouse, supposedly. There is Henry underneath his beloved tulip tree, just chatting away. And this artist has chosen to depict the house as an inn for some apparent reason. So what about Henry Sr. himself? What type of man was he, knowing all of these tales of the stubborn old Dutchman? Well, it's interesting because the stories kind of vacillate between stubborn old Dutchman and really sweet-tempered farmer. And who we have, let me see, there we go. Who we have in the house at this time, again, not a lot of genealogy, but it's important to have a little bit. We have Henry, who will be known as Henry Sr., his wife, Sarah, and their children. We've got Henry Jr., our other Henry for the evening, who's important to know about, and the other sons, William, who goes to sea, Elias, who becomes a farmer, John, who goes to sea, and Margaret Ann, who marries James Renwick Sr. I love this particular quote. Again, I'm dipping into mythology a little bit, but this is one of the depictions of Henry who sounds almost like Santa Claus. Again, we're getting that Knickerbocker kind of twist. With abundant waist and laughing blue eye, and nose of color a trifle high, a gouty foot, and long silvery hair, and a forehead free as a child's from care. And what I think of as a rather, I don't know that I'd want to be depicted this way, but here is Henry supposedly with, I'm sure, a tankard of something, and evidently underneath yet another beloved tree. But what was he actually like? There's not a lot that I could find in Henry Sr.'s own hand or words, but fortunately his family and friends, particularly the friends of his son, Henry Jr., did leave some depictions. And there is this image which descends in the family, which is said to depict Henry in the 1820s. A quote from someone who knew him in the 1820s and 30s, which I find kind of amusing because it really focuses on the fact that he wore a red flannel shirt. Not sure why that was significant, but they saw that as the symbol of a good Dutch farmer, that he was wearing a red flannel shirt. And perhaps more accurately, in the family, a descendant talks about the two different types within the family, kind of tall and light and dark and short. And Henry was the former, tall, strong, and light with blue eyes. I did find this wonderful silhouette at the Brooklyn Historical Society that is labeled Henry Brevoort, which you may question which Henry. And I do have, doubt in my mind, so I'm not claiming this is definitively him, but tantalizingly enough, on the silhouette is written in the same handwriting as it says Henry Brevoort, found 1841, which is the year that Henry Sr. died. So I am hopeful that this is actually a silhouette of Henry. The farmyard itself, so there were these tales of basically a menagerie, practically, with birds and bears and deers and all sorts of things. So what was true and what wasn't? the orchards. I have not been able to find a source contemporary during Henry Sr.'s lifetime that talks about a tree actually stopping a street going through. I have not found. But I did find many mentions of his orchard, and not apples actually, but peaches and plums. An 1820s letter writer writes into a newspaper to complain about someone else getting an award for the best fruit, and mentions others who are growing at the time, and mentions Henry Brevoort having upwards of 50 trees in bearing state at the time in the 1820s. And then many of the orchard books and publications in the early 19th century mention varieties such as the Brevoorts Morris or the Brevoort Seedling Melter, which was a variety of peach. And the menagerie, the birds. This is one of my favorite quotes. It is a letter written by Henry Sr.'s daughter, Margaret. And she's writing to her brother, and it is a fabulous depiction of life on the farmyard in Greenwich Village at the time, where she talks about her house as an ark. So she's conveying it as this ark filled with animals, saying she's looking out, the second story, her bedroom window, and she talks about her father and his passion for canaries and pigeons and ducks and geese and fowls, and the house and the farmyard are just filled with all of these animals. Tales also emerge in bird fancier publications. In the 19th century, my sources are diverse, where Henry is noted as a pigeon fancier in particular. He also emerges in a lovely story that was published in the Salmagundi magazine in 1819, where he's used as a character, and the author, James Kirk Paulding, again depicts his house as an ark and depicts the farmyard as full as a vast variety of creatures. But what about the bear? The one that I'm the most skeptical of. So it seems that for the 20th century, the source seems to be this quote from a family descendant it's about 1918 or so that he's writing this. And he mentions the deer, he mentions the birds, and he very specifically mentions a bear chained in the watermelon patch west of Broadway, which is kind of a fantastic image if you think about a live bear on 10th or 11th Street. It, conjures things in your mind. I've only been able to find one source for this, and it is a letter in 1812 from Washington Irving to his friend Henry Brevoort Jr. And he's writing saying, "I visited your parents. I walked the land with your father, and the bear is in great spirits and is the wonder of the neighboring swains. He does not seem, however, to find favor in the eyes of the old man." Now, Washington Irving's letters are very jovial and jokey and kind of jestful. If we take this letter at face value, it does seem to imply that there was a bear on the farmyard, and I admit, I was surprised. I was determined to find this one false. Now, I still feel like I need a little bit more evidence before we can start talking about a bear roaming Greenwich Village, but it does seem to be kind of the source for most of those stories. Now, when the bear was there, for how long, and where the bear came from, I haven't been able to find out. This is literally the only contemporary quote that deals with the bear. So, Henry objects. Of kind of all the mythology, one of the consistent things is this story of protest, this story of one man standing against the city and refusing to yield. His dedication to his property. Some people pitch it as a very early preservation story about his battle to save his farmyard. It becomes this very inspirational saga. This is a wonderful illustration that accompanied one of the poems, and this is supposed to be Henry objecting to the death of his beloved tulip tree and protecting it from the men with axes who have come to take it down. One of the things to keep in mind is this is all happening at a time of great change in the city, and a time when the city has adopted a plan that will stretch a grid system across the city. And this grid system was planned without any regard to existing farm boundaries. So it is not surprising that people did object to streets going through, and there was this sense of chaos as streets were planned. In reading a lot of the Common Council meeting minutes, fascinating reading, from when the streets are kind of first planned going forward, it's an endless series of petitions and protests. People either saying, I want that street going through because it will increase the property value, or please, I do not want that street because you will divide my property. So it's not surprising that this happens. And in the case of Henry, we have kind of an interesting occurrence. The map on the far left is the early planned grid. And if you can see, this is a green space which stretches really roughly, of course I can't see now, but I think it's about 10th to 16th Street between Bowery and the Broadway. And no streets were planned to go through in that section. It was planned as a green space. Therefore, Henry's house, which is within this circle, would not have been impacted. However, in 1815, the city changes that map, and this happens in many instances, but they change that map to put all of those streets through from Broadway to the Bowery. And if you look at maps from the 1820s and 30s, they show 11th Street going through from Broadway to the Bowery, even though it never went through. It was part of the plan. So I'm hoping you can see this. In pale pink, we have the rough boundary of Henry's farm. And then in light blue, we have about 6 or so streets that would eventually bisect his property. So we have in 1805, the city obtains permission from just about all of the owners to stretch Broadway from Arch Street through to the tulip tree at Union Square. That might be where the tulip tree story comes from, I don't know, but it was not on Henry's property. Then in 1825, Henry Brevoort Sr. receives about $64 in compensation for the running through of Fifth Avenue. In 1826, he objects to the opening of 10th Street, but the city is determined to proceed. In 1827, the city council is determined to open 9th Street. In 1831, Henry is approved for receiving over $3,000 in compensation for the planned opening of 11th Street west of Broadway. And then finally, in 1833, we have the opening of Wooster Street from the parade ground northward and eventually named University Place. Now, all of these dates are dates that I've been kind of culling from the records, but the thing to keep in mind is this was not a simple process. So you had people petitioning for and against, you had people receiving payments for land that they had to give up for the streets, people being assessed for funds because the city felt, well, we're improving your land, so you should pay us. And so this really complicated the process. But really roughly by about 1833, you have all these lots, all these streets going through Henry's property, except 11th Street. This is a really complicated story. And so I'm just going to touch on it here, and then a little bit later on, we're going to kind of rush through a trail of bureaucracy and when we talk about it. But really roughly, so 1831, 11th Street west of Broadway is opened. 1836, the city is determined to go ahead and put 11th Street through between Bowery and Broadway. But then in 1837, there's a significant economic depression, and the property values in New York City are severely impacted. This combined with apparently a request from 89-year-old Henry Brevoort Sr. saying, please let me die in the farmhouse which has been in my family, just grant me this request. And so we have in the 1830s, we end up, and I'm sorry if this is too pale, but again, here is the boundary. And then when you end up is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of partial blocks that his property is bisected into. We still have his farmhouse and a little bit of the orchard, but one thing that is lost and that I am really surprised did not turn up in the mythology is the family cemetery. And I ran across no reference to it in that mythology, which you think it would come up. Where I uncovered references to it were these wonderful series of family history notes written by Henry Jr., so Henry Sr.'s son, where he talks, and I'm aware I'm unleashing a little bit of mythology here and a slightly crazy story, so I do this hesitatingly, but Henry Jr. talks about the removal of the family cemetery, which was near 410th Street, and that his father had to disinter the bodies. And included in that, Henry, I'm hesitating because it's such a crazy story, but Henry Sr. uncovers a richly decorated coffin with a lengthy body inside and silver buttons. And the family decides this is the infamous family ancestor known as Silver Buttons. I haven't been able to verify that story. I'm just going to say that right there. But this is a story that Henry Jr. is writing. And Henry Jr. himself eventually has to take hold of those remains. And he takes charge of them. And he writes that he inters them underneath Grace Church. So supposedly the bodies of the Brevoorts are underneath Grace Church. I really want to find out about Silver Buttons, though. It's kind of a fabulous story. Now, the fact that there was a cemetery is confirmed in this document from 1760 between two brothers, Elias Brevoort and Hendrik Brevoort. And Elias is giving up claims to property, but he very explicitly reserves the right to use the burying ground. And he reserves the right for he and his family to be buried there, as well as reserves the right for them to progress through the land in order to conduct burials. So there was indeed the cemetery. So we're kind of at about 1833 or so, we have Henry and his wife Sarah ensconced on the family farm, but it's been greatly compromised by the cutting through of the streets, but they still have their house and they still have a little bit of an orchard. So, if you're not confused yet with all the various Henrys, we're going to move slightly from Henry Sr. to Henry Jr. Those are just really the only two that you have to remember, and maybe Silver Buttons, depending on your interests. But, so if you remember the rough family tree from Henry Brevoort Sr. and his wife, we have Henry again, William, Elias, John, and Margaret. And it's really Henry Jr. that kind of emerges with kind of the most glittering lifestyle and the kind of man-about-town character. He makes his fortune by trekking to Montreal and the employee of John Jacob Astor, and also travels in Europe. And he has a group of rambunctious, kind of bright young things as his friends, including Washington Irving, James K. Paulding, Governor Kemble, and they all had nicknames. Henry Brevoort seemed to be Nuncle, he was known by. Now, I haven't found a lot of poetry about Henry Brevoort Jr., but he is featured in a silent film, which is worth a look, if you would like to see it, called In Little Old New York from 1923 with Marion Davies. And he is his character. It also is, I think, John Jacob Astor is in there, Washington Irving, Livingston. It has a whole host, Robert Fulton, a whole host of characters. And Henry Brevoort is in the title cards, which I love, is stated, is very much claimed as Henry Brevoort, one of New York's first men about town, which I love. So Henry Brevoort marries at about the age of 35, and he settles down in Lower Manhattan. This is not an accurate depiction of Lower Manhattan. It's again from the movie, but I love the historical inaccuracy in this image, and it just makes me laugh. I love this boy with the giant hoop and the girls kind of with their pantaloons and the vision of Lower New York. So Henry marries and settles in Lower Manhattan. He marries a fairly wealthy young lady. He's about 35, she's about 18, Laura Carson Brevoort, and they proceed to have numerous children. 8, I believe, altogether. Henry and Laura are kind of settled in Lower Manhattan, but about 1830, they decamp to Europe with no immediate plans to return. And some of their children are born in Europe, all of the children travel with them, and many of them have their important school years in Europe. Henry does start to think about returning to Manhattan, and he writes to Washington Irving saying his house, most likely meaning on Lower Broadway, 15 Broadway, is rather too small for my present stock of books and children. I like that the stock of books and children is equivalent. But he hopes to build another of more suitable dimensions. And this issue is solved with some conversations, some letters with his father. He writes to his father, who owes him a debt, his father again being our Henry Sr., and says to his father, let's consider the debt forgiven. Just give me however many lots on your farm that you want, whatever you think is appropriate. I just ask that they're all together. And I'm hoping that, if we are able to, my family and I can return to America and I can build a house on the family land. And so in 1833, again, I'm sorry about the cutoff. In 1833, Henry Sr. and Sarah convey 5 lots of land to Henry Jr. And they are at 5th Avenue and 9th Street. So at the very western edge of the property. If you remember, the farmhouse is here, and the lots of land that Henry Brevoort Jr. gains are at the far western edge. And there are some surviving sketches of the house. It's often attributed to Alexander Jackson Davis or Ithiel Town. There's no definitive proof, but it's usually attributed to them based on the similarities with other projects at the time, as well as this fabulous sketch of the house, which was 24 5th Avenue, by Alexander Jackson Davis and in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. Now, at the time that Henry is building, so we have about 1835, while this is still an emerging residential district, there certainly are other people that are thinking like him and building and living not in Lower Manhattan and the commercial center, but further north. So we have Washington Square designated as the parade ground in 1826, which is essential. We have Colonnade Row in 1832 on Lafayette. We have the Samuel Ward Mansion on Bond Street in 1827. And of course, we have the Row in the 1830s. So you start to see this emergence of a more fashionable residential district. This is an amazing photograph from about 1851 of the Brevoort house. It's a lovely photograph. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a series of shots, and this person kind of moves throughout the shots, and there's also someone peering out the window. I've put an 1835 date for the house. That is when it first appears on the tax assessment records. Interestingly, Henry is probably directing a lot of this construction, it seems, from overseas. He doesn't seem to return to New York permanently until about 1835, and the family as a whole continues, although they have this grand mansion as their base, they continue to travel back and forth to Europe. They have summer homes, they go to the South to visit family, but this does become their New York City base, and quite a grand one. So by 1840, we have the household here, and the 18 people are spread across 3 floors, a cellar, and then an adjoining stable. And those 18 people no doubt include family members, but also servants, and no doubt some nannies for all of those children. One reason this house lives on in kind of New York City lore, despite its 20th century demolition, is the story of a ball. And this again is I think this is late 19th century description of the ball, and this is the story you hear often, that there was this masked ball held by the Brevoorts, that it was the social occasion of the early 19th century, that there was scandal and intrigue. I think some of them talk about balls being banned afterwards because this was so scandalous. What is true is that they did have a ball. They didn't seem to entertain elaborately, except in this one instance. And in February of 1840, they do hold a ball. I particularly love, and it is a costume ball. It's not a masked ball, but it is a costume ball. And I love this particular quote because it talks about, let each of the attendees go in the disguise of ladies and gentlemen. We doubt not it would require some exertion to sustain the characters well. So, and there are quite a few digs in the newspapers about this ball, in particular because the Morning Herald is emerging at this point, and it is providing a lot of details about private entertainments. So this is a musical soiree which happens before the Brevoort ball. Another family holds it. And shockingly for many, these newspaper articles are saying who's invited, what were people wearing, what was the entertainment, and giving kind of these details, not about public balls that were perhaps held at the City Hotel, but about a very private ball. And the Brevoort ball is given full coverage. The front page of the paper, endless stories both before and after, floor plans of the house, details on what the furnishings were, lists of who attended, although I don't know if you can see it, but most of the people it would say, Mr. B-T. So it wouldn't give the full name, but you can kind of suss out in some instances who the people were. And while the Morning Herald was guilty of the most coverage, there were certainly other newspapers that were covering it as well. And sometimes they were, I think the one at the bottom is a good excuse, where they basically say, I can't believe any newspaper of repute would cover the ball. And then they proceed to talk about it because other newspapers talking about it gave them an excuse to talk about it. And it even makes some London papers, which I find it interesting. I think this is a little bit of a dig at the Morning Herald, where it says the Morning Herald, which may be considered as the Morning Post of American journalism. But there are also, thanks to that article and diarists such as Philip Pound, great descriptions of who was wearing what. And it's definitely a cross-section of costumes. We have animals. We have definitely ethnic stereotypes. We have literary characters. We have, this one I find intriguing. This couple, each of them, one was dressed as a half Quaker, each side of them. So half Quaker and half ancient Marquis. I'm not sure what that would look like, but I find that intriguing. And then, you can't quite see it, but at the bottom we do have Mr. Emmett as a schoolgirl and Mrs. Emmett as a Swiss boy. The one thing I really love about this coverage is those floor plans, because frustratingly enough, again, although this house stood until the early 20th century, I have not been able to find any interior views of the house. I'm sure they exist, but I haven't found them as of yet, so no photographs or sketches. So this coverage, while seen as very invasive at the time, gives us some wonderful details. The Brevoorts did invite the reporter to the event. Many people theorized at the time that this was a way to kind of soften the coverage, that if he was a guest, he wasn't quite so rude. I don't know if that worked out the way they planned, and I wonder if they got a little bit of satisfaction, because I've corrected this, but the floor plans were actually reversed, and the list of artists, the reporter got a lot of the names wrong. It's very difficult to figure out what artist he's talking about. But they do give a great example, and when seen alongside the floor plan sketch by Alexander Jackson Davis, you can see they align quite closely. So you've got a similar setup of rooms, and then wonderfully, the description also allows us to see, that there was a red parlor, that there was a green drawing room, a blue parlor, a yellow dining room, and some of the artwork is specifically mentioned, such as a portrait of George Washington in the dining room, and the raffle by William Sidney Mount, which is now at the Met, was also in the house. So it gives us this opportunity to really get a little bit better sense of what this house looked like. So by 1840, we again have this farm that is largely still open space, with the farmhouse at the far east and Henry's grand mansion at the far west. Now, I promise not as many deaths, but there are still deaths. And Henry Sr. Dies in 1841. It's actually less than 6 months after the party that his wife Sarah dies, and a year to the date after Henry's death, or after Sarah's death, Henry Sr. dies. Most of the coverage at the time, and there's some wonderful descriptions of his funerals and his funeral and his burial at St. Mark's, but a lot of the descriptions focus on this unchanged farm that he held for generations, this unchanged plot of land in Greenwich Village. Generations, sometimes it says hundreds of years that he held on to this land, which is not technically true. So here we have, again, the boundaries of the farm, and Henry Sr. himself started selling off property in the early 19th century. He sells 2 lots on Bowery to John Jacob Astor in 1807, 2 lots in 1818, also on the Bowery. In 1831, he's forced to sell an entire block of his property, roughly 33 lots or so, to pay the debts of his son William, who I wish I had time to talk about, went to sea, captured, imprisoned, racked up a lot of debts. And then, of course, the 5 lots that I mentioned that went to Henry Jr. in 1833. So really what you have left for Henry Sr.'s heirs are this little portion, a portion here, here, and here. So you have 4 partial blocks of land that are left to distribute amongst the heirs. And there are some complications in the will, and it takes until about 1843 to settle it. A grandson objects, he's been cut out of the will, and he raises a protest. They eventually satisfy him, and then they're able to move forward with distributing the land, and not only kind of distributing the land, but developing the land. Not only the land within the farm itself, but in the case of Henry Jr., some land adjacent to the farm. So we have, again, his house in 1835, which is on the farm itself. In about 1844 to 46, he acquires property on 11th Street between 5th and 6th for row houses. All of the siblings, all the surviving siblings, develop property on 11th Street and 10th Street between University Place and Broadway. Henry Jr. also develops a corner on 5th Avenue and 8th Street just outside the proper farm. We have all of the siblings again developing the land where Henry Sr.'s farmhouse stood. We have Margaret and her husband and son developing a lot of land on 9th Street and 5th Avenue. And Margaret and her son developing the hotel at the corner of Broadway and 11th Street. And then we have, I just have to mention the Brevoort Hotel. It's outside of the farm property and is not developed by the family. So there's no family connection other than the name to that property. Keeping in mind what, as they're working on this development of their inheritance, one thing that is still slightly a problem is the 11th Street issue, which has not yet gone through. So, I'm saying 20 years of bureaucracy in 5 minutes or less. We'll see if I can do it. It's so complicated that the city actually produced publications to try to figure out, okay, what did we do? When did we do it? Who said what? So we're going to press on more. So we have to, remind you about earlier, we have 1831, west of Broadway is opened. 1836, they want to open between Broadway and Bowery, but they do not. The Depression hits. Henry says, please let me die in my home. Between 1837 and 1843, the city really doesn't act. There are endless petitions back and forth between people who want the street to go through and people who don't want the street to go through. The street committee actually agrees with Henry Brevoort Jr.'s request to let's just, stop and let's not put the street through. In 1843, heirs of Henry Sr. sell lots on Broadway to the vestry of Grace Church. And Henry Sr.'s grandson, James Renwick, is ultimately the architect of that property. Interestingly, in the conversations about the heirs selling this property to Grace Church, they make it very clear, we're not going to guarantee that this street won't go through. We can't guarantee that there won't be assessments. We will sell you this land, but we cannot guarantee that this will be a forever unchanged block. In 1843, the city actually makes an application to the state legislature to change the map and to consider 11th Street just stopped and not going through Broadway and Bowery. Finally, in 1845, the state does pass a bill, but they say the city still has 18 months. If they really want to put the street through, they have 18 months to do it. The city does not, so they fail to act between 1845 and 1846, and meanwhile Grace Church dedicates their new sanctuary in 1846. The story continues. In 1847, the city's council says, oh, we know, the state passed a bill saying we had 18 months and we didn't do it, but really we don't think we don't need to abide by that. And so they passed a resolution in 1847 basically saying we're going to do it. We're going to go ahead and we're going to put the street through. And interesting, what they do essentially is hold a lot of meetings, accrue costs for those meetings, and then charge the state for those meeting costs. So in 1849, there's this wonderful little piece in the New York State Municipal Gazette talking about, we could probably stretch the amount of money that they're charging us for all of these meetings. If we laid all of these, I think it says silver dollars, if we laid them end to end, we could cross the street. With all the money that we're spending, will this never end? And it seems to be by 1849 that this finally is laid to rest and the city gives up and 11th Street is not put through. So, which story would you rather have? Would you rather have one of endless bureaucracy, people signing petitions, people failing to act, or would you like a story of this fabulous old Dutchman who refuses to yield to the city? So I think it's kind of understandable why the mythology lives on, because it's a much easier story than to go into this complicated, there were laws and people did things and then they didn't do things, and some people wanted it open and some people didn't. Let's just stick with the story of one Dutchman fighting the power of the city and stopping and saving his house. So we have, I think, with 11th Street kind of finally almost resolved, there's the continued development of the Brevoort family land, and I can't go into all of it, but I thought maybe a good example would be a stretch of row houses that would have stood on 10th Street between University Place and Broadway, and those were developed by the siblings. Specifically, there's this wonderful document that dictates, it's an agreement that is signed between Henry Jr., his brother Elias, and their brother-in-law, James Renwick Sr., basically saying, we will give you money as long as in return you guarantee that you will build 8 three-story brick houses not to cost less than $38,000. So again, it's one of those agreements that maybe we're familiar with, where they want a substantial house built on the property. They're providing the funds to their brother-in-law as long as he gets this done. And as shown in this tax bill that from 1846, it's a tax bill of Margaret Renwick, so Margaret Brevoort Renwick. And if you can see it, it does show that in 1846 on 10th Street, there are substantial houses and lots valued at about $7,500, and there are 8 of them. So in this way, they both developed the land specifically, but then they also definitely sold lots out of the family, but they continued to hold certain lots and develop them for themselves. And this is kind of a good opportunity to take a look back at that wonderful image that shows Union Square looking south from the 1820s, and to compare it to, what would it be, 20 or so years later, that view. So looking south from Union Square, if you can see that, this would roughly, so here's Grace Church, and this would be Henry Brevoort Sr.'s land. So by this, I think this view is 1849, so by 1849, you really have no remnants of the farm left. The farmhouse is gone, the orchards are gone, and the family themselves is building up the property with row houses, and what they're not building on, they're selling off. And yet another death, sorry. This is an awkward transition between development and death. But we do have to talk about Henry Jr., the other important character. Before the 11th Street story is actually settled, so 11th Street saga spans the lifetimes of both the Henrys and isn't solved until after the death of Henry Jr. He dies in 1848, and once again, it's a process of dividing up his property amongst his heirs. If you remember, I mentioned before that he had property within the farm, so his mansion, as also the row houses that he developed. And I think the 11th Street row houses between 5th and 6th Avenue are a good, much like I talked about the 10th Street row houses, this is a good example to talk about how Henry Brevoort Jr. developed his property and also divided it. And there's also some mythology. So this is from a booklet from the 1960s, and I think this might be the source of the lore that these houses were built as dowry houses or gifts for Henry Brevoort Jr.'s 5 daughters. And it very much specifically states the children's names here, and it mentions their dowry houses built on the remainder of the old Brevoort farm. I haven't found any evidence that they were gifts for the daughters or dowry houses. However, I don't think it is such a big leap to imagine that he did develop them as investments for his children. If you remember this earlier quote, when his nephew objects to Henry Sr.'s will, he's a little dismayed that his children will be losing out on some of that inheritance. And perhaps this spurred him to develop properties for his own children. And as often happened in the village, these developments were not about living there, but developments as benefits for heirs and a source of income. And we have, in 1851, Henry Brevoort Jr.'s property is divided, and this is a wonderful family document which lists each child and what they received. And basically the children got lots of property that were all roughly equivalent. So they were scattered all over. They were on 11th Street, they were on Madison Avenue, they were on 39th Street, but all of the children got roughly equivalent values. And so we see what are now known as 14, 16, and 18 West 11th Street go to Laura, 20, 22, and 24 go to Meta, and 26 and 28 go to James Carson Brevoort. And this is another instance where I really wish I could delve into the characters of these people a little bit more. James Carson Brevoort is an early president of the Long Island, now Brooklyn Historical Society, and one of the reasons why there are so many fabulous Brevoort papers. And Meta Brevoort, who again inherited 20, 22, and 24, although she did not live there, she owned those properties for quite some time, and she was a completely fascinating woman, an early mountain climber. So in 1865, she climbs her first peak, and between 1860s and 1870s, she does multiple trips with her nephew and their dog Shingle. So while this is a list of Shingle's accomplishments, and he was quite well known in the mountaineering community, it also is a list of Meta's accomplishments, because she did most of these hikes up until the time of her death in England. And what of the mansion that was built in 1835? Henry dies in 1848. This one does not stay within the family. It is sold rather quickly. It's sold in 1850 to the Durham family, who owns it until the 1920s, when it actually passes back into the hands of the Brevoorts. A Brevoort descendant, Edith Brevoort Kane, who's married to George Baker Jr., if I can remember that correctly, purchased the house and announces that she plans to bring this back as a center of social engagement and a place of culture. And this article is a great overview of all the crazy mythology. So it mentions everything. It mentions, stopping 10th Street, stopping 11th Street, the ball. It mentions it all. Alas, that is not to be. They never actually live there, and the Bakers sell it off, and it is demolished in about 1925, which is a fairly typical story, right, for Lower Fifth Avenue. So we have in this kind of saga this complete transformation of a landscape, and between these two Henrys, and I'm hoping that while we kind of did this mad dash from we were like in the 18th, 17th century to the 20th century, it gave you a little bit of an overview. I think it's a great opportunity looking at this family to get a sense of change over time. Again, each topic I mentioned I think could be its own lecture, so this is just an opportunity for me to give a broad overview of the history. If you're interested in paying homage to Henry Brevoort Sr., you may do so. There's a plaque in Grace Church which memorializes Henry and Sarah and mentions, again, the mythology about the land standing unbroken possession of the colonists of New Netherlands. And I like that Sarah is given some note as well. There's not a lot written about her, but she is she performed faithfully the duties of wife and mother. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this was an enjoyable run.
Looking at this slide,
Yeah.
it has Grace Church and I suppose going west. What's that group of, it looks like trees?
Oh, here? That's going to be Washington. So she was asking about this area. So that would be Washington Square. Yeah. And I will say that I'm sure people will have fabulous questions, and I have a lot of things in my brain, but I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all of them, but I will do my best. So, Todd, do you mind calling who I couldn't tell who was next.
Okay.
Were you in the red there? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether perhaps the real reason for 11th Street not going through during the latter 1840s is that this area became a very fashionable area, and by not putting 11th Street through, it kind of protected them from the slums that were developing east of Lafayette or 4th Avenue.
Well,
Did everyone hear the question?
could everyone hear that about wondering if the stopping of 11th Street was partially to create this little isolated enclave? I mean, there are lots of theories, but there certainly were property owners petitioning to put the street through. So some people did see it of value. Ultimately, obviously, it was in Grace Church's benefit that the street did not go through, and ultimately they acquired more of that property. And obviously they had some movers and shakers within their congregation, so that certainly might have been a factor as well. Again, we could do a whole lecture just on 11th Street. I'm not sure people would find it fascinating, but that's really, okay, one in the back there.
Yeah, but, if I could just say something first and then ask the question. I'm the executive director of trustees of the Sailor Snug Harbor in the city.
Oh, fabulous. Great.
And so my question, for those of you here, I'm sure that you all know about it, in Minto Farm, and they clearly were neighbors.
Yeah.
My question to you is, in your studies, did you find anything that showed any interaction between the family and first Captain Randall, and then he died in 1801,
Right.
and then the trustees took over the farm and ultimately began all the development that everyone is aware of. Did you find any correspondence or anything?
Could everyone kind of hear that question? She's basically asking about Sailor Snug Harbor and any communication between the earlier Brevoorts and the captain. So that this would be
or when he died,
pre-1801.
The establishment of the trustees that took over the.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't find any, for instance, any letters or diaries that talk about that. I mean, certainly they were neighbors, right? And there certainly are some, the Brevoorts transfer some property, if I remember correctly, to Sailor Snug Harbor. So there certainly were land dealings, but that's after the death. But that totally is an intriguing part of the story. And there's that fabulous publication about Sailor Snug Harbor, that book that was really valuable. That was really valuable to me. So I think that's another one of those stories. When you look at that early Randall map, which I will go back to, you see that it wasn't this isolated farm. There were neighbors. There were kind of these fascinating neighbors from Sailor Snug Harbor to this, was it the Springlers? So it's a whole interesting little area, if I can get that to them. All right.
And they shared the bear.
Right, yes, maybe they shared the bear. Maybe the bear was, a puller. So here, this is a great slide that shows, just this wasn't in isolation, there were all these neighbors. So it'd be fascinating to learn more about that. Yeah.
Two connected points.
Yeah.
One is whether in the early days there was any overlap with the Stuyvesant farm area that got involved, and also the Bowery was going as 4th Avenue up to 14th Street, is that?
Yes, yes.
So Cooper Square as a street did not exist. The Bowery just went straight up and down, right?
Yes, correct, I believe. Stretching my memory. But what was your first question? Sorry.
The Stuyvesant.
The Stuyvesant Farm. Yes, I mean, that certainly appears, and if I could, if you expand this Randall view, you see just how close the Stuyvesant Farm was, and, those names are somewhat intertwined. Certainly at the ball, you see Stuyvesant's present. There is a Stuyvesant who weighs in on 11th Street, but if you're talking about more the 1760s and even earlier, honestly, what I had to do for my sanity and in order to focus on one area of topic is I had to say, I'm kind of working from 1784 forward. Because that would be a whole, those are centuries still of history that I think is fascinating.
I think the Bowery was also known by various names at different times,
Yes,
like the Middle Road,
absolutely,
the Middle Road,
absolutely. Just like many of the streets changed over time. Exactly. Oh, we had a question there.
In addition to the building on Fifth Avenue,
Yeah.
the name also lives on a building on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights.
Sure.
It was the Hotel Brevoort.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a family connection there?
Yes, so James Carson Brevoort, so he would be the grandson, you're testing my genealogy, he'd be the grandson of Henry Sr. and the son of Henry Jr. He marries a Lefferts and moves to Brooklyn. So there's a whole, yes, that's another topic, believe me, that's another topic. So you do see the Brevoort name. Now additionally, of course, the Brevoorts, when they arrived, they went to Brooklyn, Long Island. So there certainly was a very early presence of them, but then it comes back with James Carson Brevoort marrying a Lefferts. Yeah.
Grace Church
Yeah.
is on the property of the Brevoorts. Did the church purchase it? Did the Brevoorts give them the land?
Yeah, so in that pushing through of the bureaucracy of 11th Street, in 1843, Henry Sr.'s heirs sell to Grace Church that one portion of land that the church is built on, and later more of that land goes to Grace Church, but initially it's just that lot, I think it's lot number 3, that the church itself is built on. Mm-hmm.
How many houses among the ones you showed us that were built by
Still stand?
relatives?
I knew someone was going to ask this. So definitely we have the row houses on 11th Street between 5th and 6th. The row houses that I mentioned that Henry Jr. constructed on 5th at 9th. Not all of them survive intact, but they do. There's the hotel, certainly. It's the St. Denis or the St. Denis Hotel, right on 11th Street, survives. But the ones that I mentioned on 10th between University and Broadway, those don't survive. Yeah, so we do have a few remnants, and then other houses like the Renwick or the Mark Twain house, are demolished in the 1950s. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Has anyone really been holding
Two
up their
more
hand?
questions,
Okay.
right here.
You said that Henry Jr. went to Europe
Mhm.
and essentially lived there for many years.
Yeah.
What was his income?
Right.
A
Good
farmer.
question.
One was a farmer. His father was a farmer.
Well, he made his money, and he must have made a lot of money with the fur trade. With the fur trade with John Jacob Astor, and there's a distant family connection. So that seems to be the source of his money. He also continues to own properties in Manhattan while he's abroad. He has some warehouses. He's impacted by the 1835 fire, but that really seems to be the source of his income. So he's largely, he's a gentleman engaged in business, shall we say, for the bulk of his life.
Well, that was Judith's question. Do you have another question?
I do.
Okay.
Related.
Okay.
So he made his money probably mostly from fur trading.
Mm-hmm.
The farm itself, was it really a
working farm? It's a great question. I mean, so many of the sources talk about Henry as a market gardener, or in the more modern terms, as a truck, gardener. I haven't found any sources that have him going to market yet. But keep in mind, the time that I'm primarily talking about, so the 1820s, 1830s, he's really, for the most part, retired. He dies at the age of 94 in 1841. So the bulk of the time that I'm talking about, it seems to be that he's retired. But again, he has these peach trees and pear trees. So is he most likely probably selling them from his property? That seems logical. Also, he, like most of his brothers, had a trade. He was a wheelwright. I think a brother was a tinsmith. And one was a blacksmith. They had trades that were practical for farm work, right? You would need that kind of skill set. Yay.